Alright, so now that we have a good idea of how to work with the gradient panel, let's explore working with the gradient tool. So this is like a tool that accompanies the gradient panel. So you can't really use this tool until you've applied a gradient to an object. So let's go ahead and get set up for this. I'm going to make sure my gradient panel is open and I'm getting my last gradient by default. That's okay. And I'm going to open up my swatches panel as well because I'm just going to use some basic swatches to fill these gradients, and I'll just kind of adjust these panels so I have one over the other. So I'm going to go ahead and choose this first large circle here, and I'll apply a gradient. And I don't want these colors, so I'm going to start actually throwing away the colors I don't want. At the bare minimum, we have to have two colors, otherwise it wouldn't really be a gradient. So now that I have those two colors, I'm going to use this kind of orangish red spectrum. I'm going to actually pull this orange right on top of this other color stopper and release, and it's going to replace that color. I'll put in another orange here, put in this deep orange right over the blue. We get something that looks something akin to like a sun. I'm going to move this one over, and I think I'm going to add a yellow, and I'll double click on that yellow and I'll go ahead and move this slider from the yellow into more of the red spectrum. I like this gradient, but I don't like the location of this center point. So that's where the gradient tool comes in handy. So it's a tool that allows you to fine-tune the specific position and shape of your gradient. So to access that, we can come over here and just click the gradient tool, or my favorite way is hitting the letter G. Now beware, sometimes in the settings in your view menu, you'll have this section right here checked on, and right now I don't want to hide it's called the gradient annotator. I want to show the gradient annotator, so make sure that this is not hidden. Okay, so now that I have that available to me, this is where we get a lot of potential. If I hover right in the middle of this gradient annotator, right over that black dot in the center, and then I click and drag this over, you can see it moves that center point. Pretty cool stuff. If I come over all the way to the end, and then I click and drag, now I can adjust the size of the gradient. I'm getting something more realistic to like an actual sphere or orb. Even right on this gradient annotator, we have a slider. So instead of going into here and moving these color stoppers, I can move them right on the gradient annotator. So this is another really cool thing. I can also do the same thing where I hover over a gradient stopper, hold down on the Alt key, and I can add another color right in real time. And I can switch these. Now I have kind of like this reflected color in back. So I'll pull this one over here just for demonstration. Okay, so kind of play around with that just to get used to it. I can double click the stop right there and I can adjust the color right from the gradient annotator. Go ahead and click outside. Okay, the other thing I can do is I can adjust this aspect ratio. So if you remember before, we were adjusting the aspect ratio from the panel, but if I come up here to this black dot, you'll see I get an arrow with an ellipse next to it. That's saying it wants to adjust the aspect ratio. So I'll go ahead and start dragging this down, and now we have more of an elliptical gradient that we can adjust. So maybe I'll just have this be a small ellipse. The other thing we can do is we can hover right outside of that size stopper, and right here we get a circular arrow. This is saying that we can actually rotate this annotator. So play around with that a little bit just to get used to this. And then if I hover back inside, I'll get that preview of the extent of the gradient. Maybe I'll double click on this slider here, and I'll go into my hue, brightness, and saturation, and I'll bring down the saturation a little bit just to give it a little bit more of a highlight color, and I'll expand this out. I can come over here and adjust the size as well. The other thing I can do is I can actually grab this center point, and I could maintain this size and position. I could change this center point. I could actually move this over. So while the gradient is still maintained within this shape and position, I move the center point from this center right here. It gives you a little preview of where the actual center is. But this is just yet another modification you can do with this tool. And I've worked with other gradient tools and some of the other Adobe programs, and I have to say this is one of the best gradient tools in all the Creative Suite. Okay, so now that I have that completed, I'll hit V for my black arrow and then click outside. And let's get in some more practice working with the gradient annotator. So I'm just going for an effect of a light that's coming from this upper left-hand corner and coming down onto these little hills. I'll go ahead and click on this hill first. I can see it's filled with this swatch. I'll go ahead and click and drag that swatch down. I'll pull off some of these other colors. I'm just left with 2 colors. I'll take that swatch again and pull it over this other one. And I'll double click on that color stop and I'll brighten up this color stop a little bit more, something like that. So now that I have the colors, and then the other thing I might want to do is I might want to have it blend in with this green here at the bottom. I'm going to move this over this green color. There we go. So now that I have those colors, I'm going to hit G for the gradient annotator. And maybe instead of doing a radial gradient for this one, I'm going to switch the type to linear. So we still get the color slider, but now we just don't have that elliptical preview. I'll go ahead and change the angle. And we're going to have to spend some time kind of figuring this out, but we can move the position from the left-hand side, and then we change the size from the other side. We get something kind of like this. I'll hit V for my black arrow, and let's try another one. Let's try this one. So I'll click on that shape and go ahead and give it a default, and I'll hit the G for my gradient annotator. And this time, instead of adjusting this one, I'm going to actually just click and drag right here to just start a new one, something like this. And maybe I'll darken this part a little bit more. Spread that out just a little bit, so something like that. I'll hit V for my black arrow when I'm done, and I'll do this last one. Click the gradient. This time I'll just completely take away this color here. I'll hit G for my gradient annotator and move this. And let's see, maybe I'll move this just almost straight up and down. And I'll go ahead and brighten this color up a little bit more. I'll just move this red color over. Alright, cool. And hit the V for the black arrow. I'll go ahead and change some of this background shape here. So I'll click this background shape. I'll add the default color gradient. And maybe I'll have this be a dark color here. So I'll move the brightness down. And let's see how that looks. V for my black arrow. Let's go ahead and adjust the background sky color. As you can see, that's just one solid blue color. I'll go ahead and just drag this right down into my gradient panel, and I'll pull away these other color stops, and I'll make a copy of this one. So I'll hold down on the Alt key and make a copy, drag away the green, and let's go ahead and make one of these darker. I'm going to choose my hue, saturation, and brightness and bring down the brightness. And I'll move this one over, make a copy, and I'll double click on this one and I'll make this one brighter. Actual skies usually move from lighter on the bottom to darker on top. So I'll choose my gradient annotator tool and I'll drag a new color gradient going this way. Yeah, that's looking interesting. And I'll pull this up so we can see a little bit more of the white. And now we're getting something pretty interesting. Alright, I like that. I'll hit V for the black arrow when I'm done. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the gradient on these strokes right here. So I'll just do one stroke first. I'm going to click on this one and make sure that I have the stroke selected in the gradient panel, because that's what I need to adjust. I can see I'm using this one color. So I'll go ahead and drag that down into my gradient panel, pull off these other ones, and I'm just going to make a copy of this one. I'll make another copy of that and pull off the blue. So now we have 3 oranges, all the same color, but this time I'm going to take this middle color and I'm going to bring down the opacity to 0 and see what that does. You can see up here, it's going from this full opacity orange and it's fading into the background. Now, unfortunately, when you are adjusting the stroke gradient, it doesn't give you the gradient annotator. So you actually just need to use the gradient panel to adjust the color stops on that. And that's okay, we can do that. So I'm looking for it to kind of fade away as it hits this orange orb, and I'm not getting enough of a fade, so what I'm going to do is just make a copy of this clear translucent slider, and I'll just move that over, and so you can see now I kind of spread that transparency out a little bit more. I'll move this midpoint indicator a little bit more. I'll hit V for my black arrow and see how that's looking. Yep, that's what I was going for. Now, if I wanted to, I need to change these other strokes. So instead of applying the gradient through the gradient tool, I'm going to simply click this, the one that we just modified. I'll hit I for my eyedropper, and I'll hold down on the Alt key, and now I'm going to apply that gradient to this stroke and this stroke. Okay, I'll release the Alt key and then hit the V key when I'm done. And there you can see we've successfully added those gradients to those other strokes just using the eyedropper. Alright, so let's come down here and get just a little bit more practice using the gradient panel and the gradient annotator. Now, one thing we've gone over before is using what are called compound paths. So compound paths are all about making multiple objects read as one shape. So what we're going to do is we're going to create this battery looking object. But you can see we have a gradient that moves from this strip to this strip to this strip. And that's not by accident. So that had to happen through a compound path. So let's get some practice in doing that. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to our gradient library. So it's in your swatches panel. Go down to gradients and find metals. I'll go ahead and just move this up here and expand it. And I believe we're working with the blue steel, and right below that is copper. Okay, so now that I have those gradients open, I'll just demonstrate real quick what I mean by having a compound path. So I want a gradient that runs seamlessly through this strip and this strip. So if I select this strip, hold down on the Shift key and select this strip here, and then I apply a copper gradient, so I'll just click once, and I need to make sure that the fill is selected, so I'll swap the fill and the stroke. You can see that it's giving me two gradients of the same type. If I hit G for the gradient annotator, we have two annotator options. And this just becomes really clunky to work with. So if I want to start modifying this, I have to modify these individually. So this becomes just a lot of kind of careful guesswork that is really tedious and hard to do. What I want to do is I want to just have one gradient that just goes through both objects. So I'll hit the V key, and with both of those objects selected, I'll come up to Object, Compound Path, and Make. Now I'll hit G for the gradient annotator. And now look at this. We have one gradient annotator that's going over both of the shapes. So now I can start lining this gradient up. It's a linear gradient using the copper gradient library. And I'll start to actually adjust this. And what I'm doing is I'm lining up the annotator so that it's perpendicular with this top line. And I'll move this highlight more towards the top. And maybe I'll move this core shadow over here. Right, and that's about what I was going for. Maybe I'll move this midpoint slider up a little bit, a little more akin to real life. And I actually added a color on this annotator. I can just click on this stopper and drag away, and it'll pull that extra color I added out of there. So I'm not gonna lie, this is gonna be kind of tricky to deal with at first, but just remember from what we were doing before, we can rotate the annotator from one side and size it from one side. We can change the position from the other side, and we can move these stoppers. So see if you can get close as you can to creating that gradient. Okay, when I'm done, I'll hit the V key. I'll try that on some other shapes. So now I'm going to do these three shapes here. So I'll choose this, hold down on the Shift key, choose this one, and this one. Okay? Before I add the gradient, I'm going to turn that into a compound path. So Object, Compound Path, and Make. And now I'll come up into here, and I'm going to choose the blue steel gradient. And while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and turn off that black stroke and hit my G key for my gradient annotator. Click and drag a new gradient direction. And I'm going to flip this one, and I'll move that highlight color. Start moving these. And I'll actually just pull this one out of here. Move this one up. And I'm trying to match this highlight with the copper gradient highlight. Right about there. Move this one up a little bit. I think I'm going to need a copy of this one. So I'll hold down on the Alt key and pull a copy of that other one out. Alright, I think that's good. Maybe I'll move this midpoint indicator up to kind of condense that reflection a little bit more. I'll hold down the V key and click. Alright, let's try this outer edge here. So this is just going to be one gradient, no compound path. So I'll select that shape, okay, hit my metal gradient. This time I'll use a radial gradient. I'll hit G for my gradient annotator, and I know that I want my highlight to be right up here, and I'll expand it out, and I'll just move some of these other colors out right over here. So I'll pull out this one and this one. So I get that highlight right in the center. Pull that midpoint indicator out. I want this highlight to actually be right here. And just go from my gradient panel and move that highlight color out. Pull this in. Alright, so like that. Hit V for my black arrow. And I'll go ahead and turn off the stroke on that one. So I want to see what this looks like with just gradients. So now I can see right here, this edge and this surface and this surface kind of share the same plane with this outside one. And if I hold down on the shift key and move towards this center one, so I'm going to just make that a compound path. So object, compound path, make. I'll go ahead and apply a gradient. And this time I'll go back to being a linear gradient. I'll hit G for the gradient annotator. And I'll pull a gradient here to here. And this time I'll reverse the direction. So I want it to be dark from here and move into light. I'll make this one more simple. So I'll pull off this gradient and move this over here. And I'll actually just pull off this one as well. Oh, I like that. I'll go ahead and turn off the stroke on that. Hit V for my black arrow, and that part's done. Okay, so we have two more shapes. We have this inside shape here, and we have this one right here. So I'll just go ahead and choose this first one and go back to the original blue steel gradient. I'll just throw away all of these bright gradient colors and just kind of leave these real dark ones because this is inside of this. I'll hit G for my gradient annotator and adjust that, and then V for my black arrow. And I'll try it one more time on this part. I'll just go ahead and click my gradient tool, G for my gradient annotator, pull this one out, pull this highlight all the way down here, and actually I'll reverse these. I'll put this one up here. I'll go ahead and darken this upper part a little bit more. Bring this almost close to black. Okay, I'll hit V for my black arrow when I'm done. And there's just one more gradient. It's this shadow here at the bottom. So I'll click on this shadow shape, and this time I'm just going to use some of my grayscale values right here. So I'll just go ahead and pull on some of these grayscale values. So maybe a dark one, mid-tone, and a really light one. I want it to kind of feather away. So I'm going to choose this light gray one and bring it to 0, and I'll choose this next one and I'll bring that one actually down to 60%, and I can kind of preview that in my panel and see what that's going to look like. Okay, cool. Now I'll use my gradient annotator and I'll try to match this angle right here. I want to be perpendicular, shadow fading away. I think I'll change the opacity of this one as well. I'll bring that one down to 80, and I'll bring this one down to actually 40. There we go. Maybe I'll just take out this last dark gradient. It's a little too dark for the surface, so something like that. There we go. V for my black arrow, and I'll just go ahead and select all of this with my black arrow, take off the stroke. Hey, not bad. So that's some of the potential of using the gradient panel and our gradient annotator to get something that really has a nice, slick, rendered look. Now there's all kinds of ways and styles of using the gradient annotator and gradient panel, but this is just to jumpstart you with knowing how to use it.